Something chilling happened recently, and not enough people are talking about it. Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people, voice steady, eyes burning with conviction, and dropped a bombshell that sent shockwaves through every African who still dares to dream of unity and justice. He spoke of a foreign power, boldly and shamelessly, admitting on camera that they had sponsored rebel groups in Mali, a confession of sabotage. And what did the leaders of Africa and the African Union do? Nothing. Not a word, not even a whisper. Their silence, Traoré declared, was not neutrality, it was betrayal. In his speech, charged with fire and frustration, Traoré didn't hold back. He reminded the world how ECOWAS, backed by Western powers, scrambled to take military action in Niger the moment their friend and ally, Mohamed Bazoum, was removed from office. And yet, that same ECOWAS turned a blind eye when real terror, guns, bombs, blood, spread like wildfire across Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. The hypocrisy was deafening. The so-called African unity, he said, was nothing more than a performance, a stage play written in cowardice, silence, and incompetence. And he's not alone. Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni echoed the same bitter truth. African leaders knew NATO would strike down Libya's Muammar Gaddafi. They knew the plan. They saw it coming. But when the moment arrived, when they could have stood up and made history, they sat back and let it happen. Quiet, motionless, as if watching a man drown while holding a life jacket. But here's where the story gets even more painful, because hidden beneath this political theatre is a deeply personal tragedy, one that few people truly understand. The story of Museveni and Gaddafi is not just about diplomacy. It's about two revolutionary giants who once dreamed of transforming Africa. It's about brotherhood turned sour, disagreement turned regret, and a final moment of reconciliation that came too late. A tale of loyalty, betrayal, and the heartbreaking silence that allowed a friend to fall when he needed help the most. And that is a story you need to hear. When NATO bombs began raining down on Libya in 2011, Museveni made a shocking revelation. African leaders knew about the plot to eliminate Gaddafi. They understood what was happening, yet they failed to act collectively to protect one of their own. Why? What forces kept the continent's leadership paralysed as a founding member of the African Union was hunted down and brutally killed? What if Africa had stood united? What if the continent's military forces had mobilised to protect Libya from foreign intervention? Would Libya today be a thriving nation rather than a fractured state torn apart by civil war? And more importantly, what does this failure to act reveal about Africa's position in the global power structure? This is the story of a missed opportunity that changed the course of African history. A tale that asks, can Africa ever truly be sovereign when its leaders cannot protect each other from external threats? And what lessons must be learned to ensure such a failure never happens again? And most importantly, are African leaders even willing to learn from this story and Captain Ibrahim Traoré's leadership style? The year was 1981. In the dense forests of central Uganda, a young revolutionary named Yoweri Museveni was fighting a guerrilla war against the government of Milton Obote. With limited resources and facing a formidable enemy, Museveni's National Resistance Army needed allies. It was at this critical moment that Muammar Gaddafi, already in power for 12 years in Libya, extended his hand. Gaddafi provided military support to Museveni when he was waging a bush war against Milton Obote's second administration, explains political analyst Gawaya Tagula. It marked the start of a political relationship with Museveni, whom he once told that true revolutionaries do not quit power. This support wasn't merely pragmatic, it was ideological. Both men saw themselves as revolutionary leaders standing against Western imperialism in Africa. Both had come to power through military means, and both harboured grand visions for a united, powerful African continent free from external influence. When Museveni finally seized power in 1986, the bond between the two leaders was already strong. Gaddafi had been one of the few African leaders to back Museveni's rebellion, creating a debt of gratitude that would transcend their future disagreements. But this revolutionary brotherhood was built on a complex foundation. While Museveni was helping to establish a constitutional democracy in Uganda, albeit one that would eventually be tailored to extend his own rule, Gaddafi was implementing his unique Jamahiriya, or state of the masses, in Libya, a system that concentrated power in his hands while claiming to give it to the people. These ideological differences would eventually create tensions between the two leaders, but in those early years, they saw each other as comrades in arms, fighting for a new vision of Africa. By the late 1990s, cracks began to appear in the Museveni-Gaddafi relationship. The primary source of contention, the pace and nature of African unity, Gaddafi had become increasingly vocal about his vision for a United States of Africa, with a single government, military, and currency. He wanted this transformation to happen immediately. Museveni, while supportive of greater African integration, favoured a more gradual approach, focusing first on regional economic integration before political union. During an African Union summit in 2008, Gaddafi got traditional leaders to declare him the King of Kings of Africa, a move that many heads of state, including Museveni, viewed with suspicion. This grandiose proclamation exemplified the difference in their approaches. Gaddafi preferred dramatic gestures, while Museveni favoured methodical institution building. The tension reached its peak in March 2008, when Gaddafi visited Kampala to inaugurate a grand mosque bearing his name. What should have been a ceremonial occasion turned into a diplomatic incident that sent shockwaves through both countries. There, in scenes that would shock diplomats and excite spectators, Gaddafi's male guards clashed with Museveni's security men. So bitter were the exchanges that, in the end, Gaddafi's convoy left Kampala in a huff, as if in flight. Behind this public display of discord lay a deeper fear. According to diplomatic cables later leaked by WikiLeaks, Museveni had grown increasingly paranoid about Gaddafi. He worried that the Libyan leader might order his plane shot down if it flew over Libyan airspace. The fear wasn't entirely unfounded. By this point, Gaddafi had been actively cultivating relationships with various Ugandan traditional kingdoms, particularly the Toro Kingdom in western Uganda. He had built a magnificent palace for the young Toro king, Oyonimba Kabamba Iguru, and developed a close friendship with the Queen Mother, Best Kemagisa. Gaddafi bought homes for young King Oyo, who is fully in charge of his duties, in Kampala and London. The privileges that accrued from the royal house's friendship with Gaddafi have become the stuff of legend. This direct relationship with Ugandan traditional leaders bypassed Museveni's government and potentially threatened his authority. For a leader who had fought hard to centralise power in Uganda, Gaddafi's independent relationships with internal power centres represented a dangerous precedent. Despite these tensions, something remarkable would happen when Gaddafi found himself under threat. Museveni would set aside his fears and attempt to save the very man he had grown to distrust. If this story has stirred something in you, even just a little, then don't scroll past without doing your part. Hit that like button to show you're not one of the silent ones. Subscribe to The New Tourist if you believe these truths deserve to be heard, not buried. And don't keep this to yourself. Share this video with someone who still thinks they understand Africa, because if we stay quiet, we're no better than those who stood by and watched history burn. We're no better than those African leaders, cowards who were silent while Gaddafi was murdered. Now let's get back to the story. February 2011. The Arab Spring had spread to Libya, and protests against Gaddafi's 4-decade rule erupted across the country. Within weeks, these protests transformed into an armed rebellion, with opposition forces taking control of several cities, particularly in eastern Libya. As the situation deteriorated, Western powers began discussing military intervention. On March 17, 2011, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1973, authorising a no-fly zone over Libya and all necessary measures to protect civilians. 2 days later, NATO began bombing Libya. It was at this critical juncture that Museveni, despite his previous tensions with Gaddafi, attempted to intervene. He quickly organised a gathering of African leaders to mediate the Libyan crisis, seeking a peaceful African solution to an African problem. The African countries should not have allowed Western countries to attack Libya. Museveni would later tell the BBC. We should have intervened. We tried diplomatically, but we could have intervened even militarily. His words revealed a profound regret, a recognition that Africa had failed one of its own by not mounting a united defence against NATO's intervention. But Museveni didn't just speak, he acted. He dispatched his trusted advisor, Martin Alika, on a dangerous mission to Libya, even as NATO bombs fell on Tripoli. President Museveni asked me to travel to Libya to see what could be done to save Gaddafi, Alika wrote in his memoir. He had in mind the organisation of safe passage for him out of the country. The journey was perilous. Unable to fly directly into Libya due to the no-fly zone, Alika flew to Djerba in neighbouring Tunisia and then travelled 400 kilometres through the desert to reach Tripoli. Of course I was scared, Alika admitted. The only thing that gave me comfort was to discover that the hotel in which I stayed was also the one in which Western journalists were staying, which provided some protection. Finally meeting with Gaddafi's trusted lieutenant Bashir Saleh Bashir, Alika delivered Museveni's message. What did Gaddafi want Uganda to do for him personally, and what could Uganda do as a country? Gaddafi's response was revealing. He said Libya trusted only Uganda of all the African countries trying to help, including South Africa, Congo-Brazzaville, Mali, and Mauritania. He agreed to work with the African Union to resolve the crisis and warned that what Western powers didn't understand was that if they changed his regime, the next one would be of Islamic extremists and Al-Qaeda. His prediction proved prophetic, but Museveni's intervention came too late. NATO had already decided Gaddafi's fate, and they weren't interested in African mediation efforts. When the African Union proposed a roadmap for peace that included an immediate ceasefire and negotiations between the government and rebels, NATO and its allies simply ignored it. When Museveni told me about the mission, I remember very clearly what I told him, Alika recounted. I said, "Mr. President, you have sent me on several missions in which I was successful, but I'm afraid there's very little chance of success with this one." He was right. Despite multiple ceasefire offers from Gaddafi on March 18th, March 20th, April 30th, May 26th, and June 9th, all were summarily rejected by NATO and the Libyan rebels. The African Peace Initiative never stood a chance. Fast forward to 2023. In the West African nation of Burkina Faso, a young military leader named Captain Ibrahim Traoré is addressing his nation. The context is different. He's speaking about a coup in neighbouring Niger, but his words echo Museveni's lament about Libya more than a decade earlier. If ECOWAS can team up to oust the Niger junta, Traore declared, then why can't they team up to fight terrorism and protect Africans from external influence? The parallel is striking. In both cases, African leaders question the selective use of force, willing to intervene against internal political changes, but hesitant to unite against external threats or terrorism that kills thousands of Africans yearly. Traore went even further, claiming that Ukraine had helped terrorists in Mali attack the Malian army, highlighting what he saw as continued foreign interference in African affairs. This rhetorical connection between Museveni's failed attempt to save Gaddafi and Traore's critique of ECOWAS reveals a continuous struggle in African politics. The tension between sovereignty and international influence, between African solutions and external interventions. What makes this parallel especially poignant is that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, all countries now led by military juntas, have formed their own alliance called the Alliance of Sahel States, partly to resist what they see as undue Western influence channeled through ECOWAS. In many ways, they are attempting what Museveni suggested should have happened with Libya, African nations uniting to protect each other from external pressures and interventions. If this story moves you even a little, if it makes you think, gives you hope, or just opens your eyes to something you never knew before, then do us a small favour with a huge impact. Hit that like button so this message reaches more people. And if you believe in building something bigger, if you want to be part of a community that values truth, power, and progress in Africa, then consider joining our membership community. Your support isn't just for us, it's how we keep telling African stories that matter. But why did African leaders not protect Gaddafi? To understand why Africa failed to protect Gaddafi, we must examine his complex relationships with other African leaders. Nelson Mandela stands out as one of Gaddafi's most prominent defenders. After becoming South Africa's first black president in 1994, Mandela rejected pressure from Western leaders, including then US President Bill Clinton, to sever ties with Gaddafi. Those who feel irritated by our friendship with President Gaddafi can go jump in the pool, Mandela famously declared. This wasn't mere defiance. Gaddafi had provided crucial support to the African National Congress during the anti-apartheid struggle, even funding Mandela's election campaign. More tellingly, a grandson of Nelson Mandela was named Gaddafi, a powerful symbol of the respect Mandela had for the Libyan leader. Mandela later played a key role in rehabilitating Gaddafi internationally by brokering the Lockerbie deal, which led to Libya handing over suspects for trial in Scotland. It vindicates our view that talking to one another and searching for peaceful solutions remain the surest way to resolve differences and advance peace and progress in the world, Mandela said in 1999. Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe maintained an equally steadfast alliance with Gaddafi until the very end. Both leaders positioned themselves as anti-imperialist revolutionaries who would not bow to Western pressure. But not all relationships were so warm. Kenya's then Foreign Minister, Moses Wetangula, revealed a darker side of Gaddafi, recounting how he once saw Gaddafi slap his foreign minister during an African Union meeting, behaviour he described as unexpected of any dignified and self-respecting head of state. Gaddafi's influence extended beyond political leaders to traditional authorities across Africa. His lavish funding of various traditional kingdoms, particularly in Uganda, created parallel power structures that sometimes undermined elected governments. His flamboyant style and unpredictable behaviour at African Union summits often irritated other leaders. He would give lengthy, rambling speeches and suddenly change his positions on key issues, making cooperation difficult. Yet his financial contributions could not be ignored. Libya under Gaddafi was one of the big 5 financial contributors to the African Union, paying 15% of its budget and even covering membership fees for countries in arrears. This financial leverage gave him outsized influence, sometimes allowing him to push his agenda despite opposition from other leaders. It also created a dependency that made many African leaders reluctant to challenge him directly, as South Africa's President Jacob Zuma later reflected. Colonel Gaddafi spent a lot of time discussing a unity government for Africa that was impossible to implement now. He was in a hurry for this, possibly because he wanted to head it up himself. This combination of financial power, revolutionary credentials, and personal eccentricity made Gaddafi a polarizing figure among African leaders, respected and resented in equal measure, but rarely ignored. But here's the most interesting part of the story. On October 20th, 2011, Muammar Gaddafi was captured by rebel forces near his hometown of Sirte. The graphic video of his final moments showed him being beaten and abused before being shot. The man who had once been hailed as the King of Kings of Africa died in the dirt, betrayed by the same Western powers he had recently reconciled with. The aftermath of Gaddafi's fall proved devastating for Libya and much of Africa. Libya descended into a protracted civil war that continues to this day, with competing governments, tribal militias, and terrorist groups fighting for control. The country that once had the highest standard of living in Africa became a failed state. The ripple effects spread across the region. Thousands of Tuareg fighters who had served in Gaddafi's army returned to Mali with their weapons, reigniting a separatist rebellion that destabilized the entire Sahel region. Terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and later ISIS exploited the security vacuum. Weapons from Gaddafi's massive arsenals flowed into conflict zones across North Africa and the Sahel, fueling insurgencies and terrorist activities. The prediction Gaddafi had made to Alika that Islamic extremists would fill the void left by his removal proved tragically accurate. For Africa, the failure to protect Gaddafi represented a significant setback to the continent's aspiration for greater unity and autonomy in international affairs. It demonstrated that despite the African Union's rhetoric about African solutions to African problems, the continent remained vulnerable to external interventions. In Uganda, the reaction to Gaddafi's death revealed the complexity of his legacy. Thousands attended a memorial service at the Gaddafi Mosque in Kampala, where clerics cried and spoke in anger, blessing Gaddafi for his generosity to the Muslims of Uganda. Museveni himself wrote a scathing critique of Western intervention in Libya, arguing that the United States and European Union had no business dislodging Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi, whatever his faults, is a true nationalist, Museveni stated. I prefer nationalists to puppets of foreign interests. The question of whether Libya is better off without Gaddafi has a clear answer today. Before 2011, Libya had the highest Human Development Index in Africa, a literacy rate of 88%, high standards of healthcare, high rates of schooling for girls, significant promotion of women in society, and an annual per capita income of $12,000, the highest in Africa. Today, Libya is a fractured state with competing governments, where human trafficking, slavery, and terrorism flourish. Its oil industry, once the backbone of its prosperity, operates at a fraction of its pre-2011 capacity. But perhaps the most profound legacy of this episode is the lesson it offers about African unity, or the lack thereof. If African nations had stood together to protect Libya from NATO's intervention, as Museveni later suggested they should have, the continent might have demonstrated a level of collective security that could have deterred future external interventions. Instead, the precedent was set. African unity remains more rhetorical than real when confronted with determined external powers. As Ibrahim Traoré's recent comments suggest, this lesson continues to resonate with a new generation of African leaders who witnessed the consequences of that failure and are determined not to repeat it. The story of Museveni's failed attempt to save Gaddafi is, at its core, a story about Africa's ongoing struggle for true independence in a world still dominated by powerful external actors. It reveals both the aspiration for African unity and the practical difficulties in achieving it, the competing national interests, personality clashes, and external pressures that have repeatedly frustrated the Pan-African dream. Yet it also shows moments of genuine solidarity, like Museveni setting aside his fears and differences to try to help Gaddafi when he was under threat, or Mandela standing firm in his support despite Western pressure. These moments suggest that African unity, while elusive, is not impossible. They point to a potential future where African nations might stand together more effectively against external interventions, protecting their sovereignty and charting their own development paths. The question now is whether Africa's current and future leaders will learn from the failures of 2011. Will they build stronger, more effective mechanisms for collective security? Will they develop the economic and military capacity to deter unwanted interventions? And will they overcome the divisions that have repeatedly undermined African unity? The answers to these questions will determine whether the tragedy of Libya remains simply a painful chapter in African history or becomes a turning point that ultimately strengthens the continent's resolve to control its own destiny. As we reflect on this complex tale of brotherhood and betrayal, of missed opportunities and prophetic warnings, let us remember that history is not merely something that happens to us. It is something we create through our actions and, sometimes more importantly, our inactions. The failure to protect Gaddafi was a failure of African unity. But in that failure lies a lesson and an opportunity for a stronger, more united Africa in the future. Do you think that Captain Ibrahim Traoré is right to say that African leaders have failed to keep Africans together and against foreign influence? Let us know in the comments below. This isn't just a story about Gaddafi, it's about all of us, about remembering who we are, protecting African unity and solidarity, and rebuilding what was broken during the scramble for Africa. And if you felt anything watching this, pride, curiosity, maybe even a little fire in your chest, then don't let that feeling disappear. Subscribe to The New Tourist right now, because this isn't the last story like this we're telling. Not by a long shot. Like this video so the algorithms don't bury a story the world needs to hear. Share it with your family, your friends, and your group chats. Be the reason someone else learns the truth. And if you want to go even deeper, if you want behind-the-scenes stories, early access, exclusive discussions, join our membership community. Because this isn't just a channel anymore, it's a movement. And the story we're writing together, it's only just beginning.